On September 18th, 1931, the country that will be known as Imperial Japan invaded China. And it was all because of communism. Welcome to Lost Futures, the history channel that was designed to combat the neoliberal, anti-communist gibberish Johnny Harris and his many clones say about history. If I were to ask you, when did the Second World War start? I wonder how you'd answer. If you're an American, you'd probably tell me 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. If you're British, you'd probably tell me 1939, when Hitler's Nazi Germany invaded Poland. If you're a Canadian, you'd tell me that it was a day after Great Britain waged its war. But this is where it gets interesting. If you're an Ethiopian, you'd provide a completely different answer, as most Ethiopians marked the beginning of the war with Mussolini's 1935 invasion. However, the Chinese mark the start of the war far before that, with the Manchurian Incident of 1931. And the Koreans would mark the start of the war far before that, with the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1910. From these answers alone, you can tell how whitewashed history is, and due to this Eurocentric lens, many historians have failed to look at Japan, and few have ever dared to talk about the crimes that they committed not only in China, but all over Southeast Asia. This video came into being because I failed to responsibly tell the history of Japanese war crimes in my most popular video, Attack on Titan and the Road to Fascism. In that video, I extensively talk about Japanese war crimes, and so out of a sense of failure, I am to reconcile what I did wrong. Unlike the Japanese who deny their war crimes, I am taking responsibility. This video sets out to do a very complicated thing, as it will focus on Japanese war crimes committed in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and since these crimes have been continuously denied by the Japanese state and are even enshrined, my aim is to do my best to cover most of the crimes that they committed, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know a bit more of a history that has been whitewashed, covered up, and forgotten. However, I do have a secret agenda, as I stand on the shoulders of giants, and it's all hidden away in this mystery box. The task may seem simple, as anyone can go onto Wikipedia and search up Japanese war crimes, but what makes it complex and what may make this video worth your time is my attempt to analyze the psychology behind the Japanese warrior and peel a motive behind the crimes. The Americans and the Japanese are similar in this regard, as when they're asked to take responsibility for the war crimes that they have committed, they shift the blame onto the soldiers on the ground and absolve both the military command and the culture that creates certain systems that foster war crimes. We may call the Japanese soldiers Nanking barbarians all day, but what I aim to teach you is that there was something that drove those warriors to commit such crimes. What are these nebulous things? You'll have to watch to find out. You may think I'm oversimplifying things, and that may be because covering all the crimes that were committed would take me hours upon hours. The crimes this video will cover are: first, imperialism and forced labor; second, the comfort women; and third, Nanking. Finally, I aim to end this dark and heavy video with some revolutionary hope, as out of Japanese domination arose liberation and one of Johnny Harris's biggest fears, communism. Before we get to the crimes at hand, you must first subscribe and like this video, because this work took a mental toll on me. Or throw me a comment about something silly, because this was heavy and the research was not fun. I want to smile and laugh again.
それがキャプテンだろ。迷うな。お前がフラフラしてやがったら、俺たちは誰を信じりゃいいんだよ。
With that out of the way, we must first address the heart of the crimes. Part 1. What is Japanism. In most of my videos, I tend to prime viewers so I can prime them for big, complex ideas. This means my big ideas are tucked away near the end of the video because of the need to build towards them. This time around, I'm changing things by throwing my big idea here at the start, and it will hopefully make things easier when I do go over the crimes in question. To get to the heart of the pressing question of why did the Japanese state and the Japanese soldiers commit war crimes, we must first address two questions. What is Japanism? Or, to be more blunt, what is Japanese fascism and how was it created? What most white or Eurocentric historians get wrong when they look or study Imperial Japan is that they tend to categorize it as a militaristic, ultra-nationalist society. By categorizing it like this, these historians tend to ignore how fascism affected the Japanese populace and tend to devalue the importance of culture. Further, the Eurocentric view of this history is rooted in an Orientalism and in racist American propaganda. This propaganda first made all of the Japanese into the enemy, and secondly, it was used to contrast societies. It contrasted the so-called Western individualist society to the Japanese collective. In doing so, to the Americans, the Japanese were these mindless drones who followed every command because they lacked individualism. This is why, as a historian, I found American histories of the war questionable and had to increase my scope looking at a variety of other scholars. If you don't believe me, check out Lord Russell of Liverpool's 1958 book called The Knights of Bushido. When I first began to crack the question of what is Japanism, I found the works of a Japanese Marxist who operated before the Manchurian incident. His name was Tosaka Jun.
Tosaka defines Japanism as the Japanese form of fascism that took the form of feudalism. However, unlike the Kozaha Marxists, who took the stance that fascism in Japan was a product of feudal remnants in the countryside that held back the development of capitalism in Japan, Tosaka took the position that Japan in the 1930s was fully capitalist, specifically monopoly capitalist or imperialist, and this feudalism was merely an ideology redeployed by the Japanese bourgeoisie to support capitalism and cover up the class antagonisms that were intensifying in Japan at the time. As the subtitle suggests, in the Japanese ideology, Tosaka undertakes a critique not only of Japanism and fascism, but also liberalism, particularly cultural liberalism, which reduces liberalism to moral attitudes and sentiments. According to Tosaka, liberalism was, and I would argue still is today, not only intellectually and politically defenseless against fascism, but enables and reinforces it. While Tosaka himself was sadly defeated in his philosophical combat against fascism, his thought remains relevant to this day for those confronting fascism and the Japanese ideology in Japan and abroad.
But Tosaka wasn't the only individual who noticed Japan swinging to the right in the impacts fascism had on Japanese culture and on the Japanese people. Rather, in the 1920s, anarchists, feminists, and communists all rose to combat the emperor's ideology. And yet, all who opposed the emperor and the developing fascism were repressed, imprisoned, and executed. However, the surviving records of this era have helped future Japanese scholars understand what happened and how it happened. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese historian on war crimes, traces the Japanese form of fascism to the formation of the Meiji state and the military culture it would first cement in the 1887 Sino-Japanese War. In the creation of the Meiji state, the emperor took back power and relinquished his role as a ceremonial individual. Further, the emperor would be tied to the Shinto religion, which elevated his status and made him divine. However, on top of that, there was a value system put in place where those closest to the emperor were valued more than those farthest away. This value system would impact militarist endeavors in the Sino-Japanese War of 1887, as soldiers were told that they were ordered by the emperor to fight until death, that it was the emperor's divine wish. This, however, was just the beginning, as the emperor's ideology was soon implemented in schools where young children would get punished if they showed a sliver of disobedience. The aim of implementing the emperor's ideology in schools was to transform children into obedient vessels. Obedience was prized, it was praised, and the Japanese mind, to a degree, would get dominated by the state. Stacked on top of this would be a state built around the family model, where the emperor was the father, and a chain of obedience would be created, where sons were to obey their fathers must then obey the state, and the state must finally obey the emperor. For it was their duty to serve. It was their duty to maintain a harmony. However, the Japanese state that was profiting in the 1910s to the 1920s ran into an economic catastrophe when the USA stock markets crashed. The Depression hit, people began to starve, people began to die, the democracy became unstable, and opposition to the emperor's ideology rose. And yet, when capitalism is in crisis, fascism seems to not only rise, but thrive. The far right began to call for total domination over Asia, for with China and Asia in their grasp, they thought they could escape the Depression. The domination over Asia was justified by claims that it was Japan's divine right to rule. It was their manifest destiny. Using the political instability, the far-right fascists would try to coup the government. But the government didn't need a coup because it was already a far-right entity, as it used the Kanto earthquake of 1923 to imprison, torture, and execute left-wing activists. It was in this time frame, from the 1920s to the Manchurian incident, where Japanese fascism anchored itself, and by the 1930s it was deeply embedded into society. Yuki Tanaka stresses that in Japan, the emperor's ideology and complete obedience seemed to have worked. The totalitarian rule was veiled by mysticism, but it would be silly to say that the Japanese people were tricked or that they were deceived, that they held no responsibility for what would happen, as all Japanese people took part in empire and upheld the systems that oppressed them and those who they would colonize. Maybe it's because it was what they were taught since birth, to be unquestionably loyal. Or maybe it's because they benefited from imperial rule over others. Finally, before we get to the crimes at hand, the emperor's ideology and the desire for complete obedience didn't occur in the colonies, as the Koreans, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the people of Burma, and the people of the Philippines did not bend the knee so easily. However, what must be understood is that according to the Japanese colonizers, any disobedience to the emperor was illegal, and thus they had to dominate and force the colonized into a total submission. Thus, the very military structure differed in the colonies, as an officer's order were not mere words, but the emperor's commands. These commands were paired with a corrupt bushido that was long trained and drilled into soldiers by force. That their jobs were to conquer, fight, and die for the emperor. That they cannot surrender, but rather they must die honorably by committing suicide. Japanese fascism is so tough to define because it's this nebulous thing that is deeply connected to Japanese culture and history. As Tosaka predicted in the 1920s, it would drive the Japanese to attempt to restore things. But consider this video as a prelude to future videos about the rise of present-day Japanese fascism. What is evident is that the result of all of these things connecting and interacting can be seen in the brutal war crimes Japan committed all over Asia. Hey, Lost Futures here from the future. I just want to remind the viewer that this video covers some heavy stuff like slavery, forced labor, punishment, assault, sexual slavery, mass murder, and rape. So if things get too heavy, skip the crime, jump to part 3. Yeah, enjoy the video. Bye. In the 524th chapter of the hit manga One Piece, Oda bravely shows both his own Japanese audience and the entire world what took place on the Burma Railway, commonly called the Railway of Death. In this small snippet, the reader is shown the construction of a bridge that is solely constructed by slaves and prisoners. To press the reader and to showcase how brutal the world nobles are, Oda adds that the workers have been forced to build the bridge for over 400 years, and that for many, it has become their grave. Secondly, the reason for its construction has been long lost in the abyss of history, as slaves in the One Piece world are to submit and obey every command the world nobles give. Disobedience means death. This fictional brutality is pretty clearly based off the reality that millions of people faced when they are forced to work for the Japanese Empire, and although this first crime focuses on the Burma Death Railway, the same crimes were applied in Korea when it was invaded and annexed in 1910. Part of the reason why the Burma Death Railway is so infamous is because the most popular accounts came from white prisoners of war, and so yet again, the Eurocentric view of history veils the same practices that occurred in Korea and China. The scholar Donald Smith, a historian in labor studies, emphasizes the need for historians to go beyond the bridge and study how millions of Asians were forced into labor. The millions of Asian laborers are often ignored by Western historians because the Burma Railway of Death has been so dramatized over the years, and because Western historians are racist and value white lives over others. At the heart of this crime is empire, domination, and manifest destiny. Even before the Great Depression, Japanese fascists eyed China and envied countries such as Canada and America for having vast lands for agriculture. The start of their conquest began in 1910 with the annexation of Korea. Built into the new government was also the cult-like religion that revered the sun and Japan's mythical origins. Shinto would be paired with the emperor to make him divine, but the religion also factored in when planning for empire, as to the far right, it was Japan's divine right to liberate Asia and hypocritically rule over all Asians. This supremacy would be taught in both schools and military academies, and in the years after 1929, Japanese students were taught to dehumanize their enemies. All of these little things added up when the Great Depression hit and the nation was starving, and so the far right again began to eye China, Korea, and Vietnam, partly for the objective of feeding the nation. Although this may seem like a justification for conquest, it's kind of fucked up, because how would the Japanese employ all Chinese, all Koreans, all of the Vietnamese? The answer is enslavement or forced labor. The movie Ip Man actually shows these realities quite well, as we are shown that Japan would use the lands it colonized to extract resources in order to keep their war machine running. The mood Ip Man presents will be spoken about later, but what I found interesting was how the movie depicted forced labor and how the Japanese would keep its colonized people at the brink of starvation to motivate them to work, and if they didn't, their families would starve. Although this is a Chinese movie, and some may say they are exaggerating, this tactic was seen throughout Japanese work camps, and it was a reality for many.
Oi! 貴様の名前は?
佢想知你個名。我只不過係一個中國人。彼は陽門です。
What this spells out is first, the Japanese Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere did not set out to liberate Asia and help colonize people, but rather that the Japanese became the colonizers who forced the people who they colonized to do the hard and dangerous labor. This model of forced labor, which was practiced and implemented far before the Allies waged their war on Japan, would then be implemented when the Pacific War started in 1941. Unlike the Japanese who fought until death, The Allied soldiers would surrender, and battle after battle the Japanese ended up with a vast amount of prisoners of war. Allied soldiers who surrendered most likely believed that they would be treated humanely, but instead were sent off to build the Japanese Empire. And thus we circle back to the Burma Railway of Death, where 60,000 prisoners of war and over 180,000 Southeast Asian civilians were forced to build a railway that stretched over 400 kilometers. Construction began in 1942, and the workers were tasked to finish it by December 1943. Although the railway would be completed early, it came with severe costs, as workers starved to death, fell ill. Many were forced to keep working even when they were disabled, injured, and suffering. Many were killed because of the inhumane labor. It was truly a railway of death. In his book, The Hidden War Crimes, Yuki Tanaka attempts to answer why prisoners of war were treated inhumanely. Tanaka traces things back to the Meiji Constitution and the speed that the Japanese state developed, as although the Japanese borrowed from the French and the Germans, they lacked a sense of human rights. Further, the Japanese would pull out of the League of Nations and refused to accept the West's rules of war. And finally, there was always a power dynamic at play, where the Japanese would exploit any labor force needed to build and maintain their war machine, and so that Japanese capitalists would grow more prosperous. This complete lack of human rights led the Japanese to treating prisoners of war as the scum of the earth. In having this view, these prisoners of war and Asian laborers served three key functions. First, they were forced to extract natural resources that the empire relied upon to maintain its war machine and its profits. Secondly, Asian workers, since 1910, were pivotal in building infrastructure needed in the colonies, from mining machines to air bases, to military forts, to railways, bridges, and brothels. And third, they were to die. And yet, this is one of many crimes the Japanese state and its people committed in the Pacific War. But let's take a break and talk about some denial.
But I just want to know one thing. Why the fuck you lying? Why?
Hey, you just made it through the first war crime. Congratulations, I guess. Welcome to the first intermission where I talk about Japanese war denialists. I was personally harassed by these people when I tweeted about Iris Chang's book on Nanking, and it was wild. For a good day, this person kept replying over and over and over and over, providing a great example of what denial looks like. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is Japanese people who are still pro-empire and think that their empire did some good to Asia. As I mentioned in the first crime, the Japanese state promoted the propaganda that they were liberating other Asians from European colonizers. As this image showcases, they even called it this ridiculous name, the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Although this is obvious propaganda, as anyone who has a mind of a historian can disprove this in mere seconds, some Japanese people to this day believe it, or they refuse to take responsibility. What this denial sets out to do is present the message or the idea that the Japanese Empire was good and that it did good things. Like build infrastructure. They provided Asians with jobs. It brought civilization. It helped create the Asia of today. It was a force of decolonization.
But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Oh.
And the rhetoric these Japanese denialists use mirror the same who to this day celebrate and feel a gross nostalgia for British, French, Canadian, and American colonialism. To buy into this rhetoric, one first must have a settler's mindset. Secondly, they must have attained a sense of pride for their long-lost empire. And third, they must completely deny that their state killed thousands of people to uphold such an empire. Or completely deny the deaths, call them ally lies or historical exaggerations or fabrications. They must continue to support a narrative of lies, a narrative that covers, hides, and locks up the truth. But it's also a narrative that's haunted because the specter within the archives never rests, and the truth will always get out. None can escape the specter. None can run from the truth. Pushing the specter aside, here's the second crime. In the anime Vinland Saga, Makoto Yukimaru explores slavery and the enslavement of women during war. Although what Yukimaru presents is a singular case of a singular individual, the Japanese would systematically enslave women throughout Southeast Asia through the use of the comfort women system. In the farmland arc, viewers are introduced to the master's handmaid, Arnid, who was forcefully kidnapped from her village in Sweden and sold into slavery.
男たちの留守を狙われたんです。家は焼かれ、老いた者は殺され、女は船に乗せられ。
She would be bought by the so-called good master Kettle. This so-called good master would use Arnid as his comfort woman, but in truth, it's made apparent that Arnid was the master's sex slave and she was severely chained to the master. It's my belief that Yukimaru uses Arnid to give his viewers a small glimpse into what occurred in the Pacific War and how the Japanese would create a system that would dominate women of the nations that they conquered. Now, if I was a Eurocentric historian, I'd tell you this was a unique case and try to trick you into thinking that Americans in the Second World War did not create a similar system. They did, as rape ran rampant when Americans were liberating France and Italy. To combat rape and sexual diseases, both the Americans and the Japanese would create sanctioned brothels. However, what this tells us is that both armies were undisciplined monsters who raped women left and right. For more information on the American situation, I highly recommend this article written by Mary Louise Roberts. The Japanese case differs, however, in scale, as the state and the military built up prostitution rings that trafficked women across all of Southeast Asia. Like the first crime, this first began in Korea, but soon as Japan invaded more countries and soldiers were let loose, the state would stamp and approve sanctioned brothels. Thus, the system was created to prevent a second rape of Nanking, but further it was an extension of Japanese colonialism, as the Japanese were not satisfied with simply colonizing lands and exploiting the men, but in their sick minds, they went further and colonized women. All of this ties back to power, domination, and supremacy. By claiming that the women involved were volunteering or employed, the Japanese attempted to escape this crime, but these are lies, as many scholars have proven that all women were kidnapped and forced. The archival data further proves that the military high command and state actors stamped the organization of the system and saw it as a benefit for soldiers. These brothels and the so-called comfort women were thus used to boost morale and motivate soldiers to fight, as if they did their jobs, they would get rewarded. Although the archival records prove that the military high commands are guilty, this does not absolve the war crimes soldiers committed on the ground, as soldiers took part in kidnapping women and keeping the brothels running. Yuki Tanaka once again provides evidence that showcases that officers on the ground organized and put the policy into play. For an extensive and a more detailed telling of this war crime and the involvement of the Americans, do check out his book. This is a sickening crime, as thousands of women were forced into sexual labor, and there aren't enough words for me to describe their pain. The pain would continue after the war, as these crimes had lasting psychological impacts, as women were traumatized, and when they returned home, they lived in shame. Years after the war, some women built up the courage to tell their stories, but their testimonies were denied. And what makes it even more sickening is that the war criminals who committed these crimes got away, and there hasn't been an official apology. Rather, this crime is not recognized by the Japanese state. It is truly a crime that is haunted by denial. Although many have already forgotten that these crimes occurred, I'm here to remind you so that you, dear viewer, may never forget. Because this crime shall never be forgotten. We cannot allow it to be forgotten. Hence, there were different methods the Japanese took to dominate others, and sexual labor was one of many. Initially, this is where I thought it would be best to end the discussion on this war crime, but I don't think it's enough. Part of the reason why this war crime is contested is because denialists claim that there aren't any records that prove the testimonies that came out in the 90s. Tanaka, a lead Japanese historian on war crimes, and a person who basically sleeps in the archives, has an explanation for this. First, the Japanese burnt many records that were within the brothels. Second, the records that are tied to the policies the government created are locked up in archives. This is typical when it comes to rape and atrocities committed on the vulnerable in war and in colonial states. Further, the oral testimonies came 40 years after the tribunals, and because they were oral, they were not considered authentic. To some, they were considered random. Keep in mind, this is still the current situation when it comes to how the law treats or deals with people who have suffered and have been affected by sexual assault and sexual crimes. Mind my language, it's fucked up. What's even more fucked up about this crime is that since most of the evidence are oral testimonies, the victims have been denied recognition. Instead, what they have courageously told the world are now called by some as fabrications, lies, and attempts to trash the image of Japan. This so-called lack of evidence further feeds into denialism, but this is not to say that there is no evidence. Rather, it simply makes telling the story of this crime much, much harder, because the evidence is locked away and purposely kept away from the public. Despite these limitations, Tanaka is able to trace and create a timeline through the use of officer diaries and instructions. As a researcher, the lack of information makes this crime tougher to cement than the others. But on the other hand, I am an indigenous person who has been taught that oral histories are legitimate and trustworthy. The province I live in even houses a unique archive of residential school oral testimonies. Sometimes the only window into the past historians have are through these grim stories that allow us to question things and investigate things further. For those who doubt me, watch my video on archives and learn how states lock, hide, and steal memories. Before we explore more horrors, let's take a break and discuss some more denial. If you're a historian who tweets about Japanese war crimes, you'll eventually meet certain denialists who link a document written by a Harvard American scholar on comfort women. The gist is, this scholar tries to prove that the Japanese did not commit any crimes in regards to the comfort women system, and that the women are the ones who are responsible. His claims lay on the fact that the women were paid and thus consented to sexual acts in question. Small edit here. The very term comfort woman is part of this denial, and it's been used by academics to cover the truth. These were not comfort women. They were enslaved women. The historians I've read for this essay tend to clarify this immediately, but use the term comfort women system probably because it's been so often used in the academic world, and so that the general populace would get what is being spoken about.
내가 왜 위안부입니까? 나는 이용수입니다. 내가 더러운 위안부 왜 위안부입니까? 위안부가 뭐 세상은 뭔지 압니까? 우리가 스스로 갔다는 거예요. 스스로 가가지고 일본을 위로하면서 군인을 위로하면서 일본 상대해줬다는 그게 위안부예요.
Japanese war crimes denialists then use this article to spread propaganda that this war crime is a fabricated lie that the Chinese and the Koreans are spreading to harm Japan. They further use this article to make their followers spread this misinformation and harass those who call out Japanese war crimes. Now this is kind of depressing, but it's also really funny when you Google the scholar and find out that all of the academic community ripped his paper to shreds and dunked on him with archival records that prove this war crime did in fact happen. At the same time, the denial here is sickening because it's a total denial of the gross and disturbing realities women went through under Japanese occupation, and it attempts to completely erase their suffering and the responsibilities Japanese soldiers on the ground and in high military command should have held. Instead, this kind of denial pushes very real historical realities into the realms of myth and further showcases how some Japanese people who live in the year 2023 continue to avoid responsibility. But if I continue to speak about responsibility, I'll spoil the mystery box and my secret agenda. I'll say this before we move on. Fuck these Japanese ultranationalists who disregard the victims of war crimes, the people who suffered, the people who were assaulted, who were forced to be slaved, women who were kidnapped and raped. It's fucking disgusting to see, and Japan has a real problem with denial. It's a problem that deserves its own video, but it doesn't linger with the online far right, but with mangakas, anime producers, directors, singers, and politicians. This was supposed to provide you a break from the horrors, but it seems like we can't escape them. This next crime is pure terror, so be warned. And if it's too much, skip it. If there's a scene in anime that showcases a glimpse into the horrors that occurred in Nanking, it has to be Vinland Saga. Vinland Saga Season 1 truly shows how men become devils. And the horrors that come when an invading force that lacks discipline gets their hands on the vulnerable. Men who have surrendered. Men who have tossed their weapons. The elderly, the disabled, the children, and the women. What happened in Nanking? Why did the rape of Nanking happen? Why was the city set on fire? Why were so many killed? Why were so many murdered? Why were the women raped and killed? Why did the Japanese do it? And why do the Japanese continue to this day deny it ever happened? I'm not sure I can answer all these questions, but Iris Chang gives us a window into what happened in Nanking and why it happened. However, to a degree, I disagree with Chang on the why it happened part. Chang traces things back to how the Japanese thought they could sweep into China and occupy it all in a mere 3 months. However, something miraculous happened. The Chinese, who weren't literate in the art of war, who lacked Western military tactics, who lacked Western technology, and in comparison to the Japanese, were not trained as rigorously, held off the initial invasion. The Chinese fought bitterly and defended itself before America or Britain or Australia ever joined in on the war. The Chinese even killed a cousin of the Empress. Take for an example the siege of Shanghai, which was estimated to take the Japanese a mere few weeks to conquer, stretched into a brutal 4 months of fighting. The Japanese were humiliated as they were supposed to be the best and the very strongest, and yet it took them months to take a single city. In Chang's view, after Shanghai, the Imperial troops' mood turned ugly as they marched towards Nanking. Chang makes it seem like it was this humiliation after the victory that partially led to the rape of Nanking, as the Japanese desired revenge for those who fell. I disagree with this, but let's continue with Chang's telling of this war crime. According to Chang, there were 2 key players that orchestrated the rape of Nanking, but there's also a sudden power shift in command that occurred right before the attack. Initially, the soldiers and the officers were under the command of Masui Iwane, who was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese army in the region of Shanghai and Nanking. Out of the 3 leading officers, he was first the eldest, secondly, he had the most disciplined troops and sought discipline from all troops, and finally, he was a Buddhist. His spirituality plays a factor in all this, as the other officers were deeply fucked up. For an example, one of the leaders was Kisago Nakejima, a man who was called the Small Himmler, was a man who was a specialist in thought control, intimidation, and torture. Chang calls him a sadist, as he packed a special kind of oil on his trip to Nanking, one that was used to burn bodies. Even before Nanking, he was called a beast and a violent man. However, to simply place the blame on what occurred next on the commanders would be silly, as on the way to Nanking, small villages were raided, plundered, burnt to ash, the men were slaughtered, played with, and Chinese women were taken as sex slaves. What this proves is that Nanking was not a unique case, but one of many rapes that occurred all over China and Southeast Asia. So Nanking is encircled, but before the attack, 2 key things happened. 1. Masui Iwane falls ill. Secondly, he was replaced by the emperor's uncle, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka. The prince was also friends with Nakejimi and had the power to override all authority. When Matsui found about these changes, he grew wary and gave moral commandments for the invasion. He wanted all troops to be disciplined, stating, "This is a historic moment." He knew this would attract the world's attention. These commandments were foreign rights, no plundering, no fires, no looting, and he wanted the military police to be in the city to stop and punish any unlawful acts. However, the prince met with Nakejimi and an order was sent out. Chang states that there was no proof that the prince sent out the order, but it's quite odd that this order was sent out right after the 2 most fucked up leaders met. The order was, kill all captives. This was a twisted command, as although the Japanese were outnumbered, they promised the Japanese soldiers in the city that if they surrendered, they would be treated humanely. But the order, the rule of engagement, was soon written and passed down to the lower echelon, and so when the 300,000 Chinese soldiers surrendered, the entire city was held captive. This meant all were to be killed. The logic behind this order was that the captives couldn't be fed. It's a logic that's based off bullshit. Pure horror began as the Japanese disarmed the Chinese, divided the prisoners, and took them to separate areas where their executions began, and their bodies would be disposed of. At first, the operation was discreet. But soon mass executions began where prisoners of war were taken to the river, killed with a machine gun, and tossed in. The dead, the bodies, and even prisoners of war who were alive were taken to Mount Mutsu, where they would be burnt to ash. The Japanese reporters at the scene reveled in it, calling the surrender a magnificent view. The dehumanization soldiers were taught in the military academy came into fruition as a sick necropolitics covered the city. The Chinese were seen as insects, animals, and were thus deserving of death. Thousands upon thousands were murdered, and when all were dead, there wasn't anyone left to protect the citizens. This is when the rape truly began. Although rape was outlawed, it was embedded in military culture that the Japanese held the sick belief that having sex with a virgin would make them stronger in the battlefield. In the first 6 weeks of the invasion, Japanese soldiers raped and then killed women to dispose of the evidence. However, there is evidence of these crimes, as there are photographs, oral testimonies of the survivors, and written documentations, which were recorded by 2 men who were in charge of the Nanking safety zone. The first is quite an odd fellow. His name was John Raba, and he was the leader of the Nazi Party of Nanking. To the Chinese, he was the living Buddha of Nanking, but to the Japanese, he was a strange and unlikely savior. When he was asked by the Japanese why he stayed and kept interfering with the military's affairs, he told them, "I've been living here in China for over 30 years. My kids and my grandchildren were born here, and I am happy and successful here. I've always been treated well by the Chinese people, even during the war. If I had spent 30 years in Japan and were treated just as well by the Japanese people, you can be assured that in a time of emergency, such as the situation China faces now, I would not leave the side of the people in Japan." The second was a Dr. Wilson. Here are some testimonies of what occurred in Nanking. Rabe's comes from his reports to Hitler, and Dr. Wilson's were written in his diary and in letters to his wife.
December 13th, 1937. 3 of us committee members drive out to military hospitals that have been opened in the Foreign Ministry, the War Ministry, and the Railway Ministry, and are quickly convinced of the miserable conditions in these hospitals, whose doctors and nurses simply ran away when the shelling got too heavy, leaving the sick behind with nobody to care for them. The dead and wounded lie side by side in the driveway leading up to the Foreign Ministry. The garden, like the rest of Chengshanlu, is strewn with pieces of cast-off military equipment. At the entrance is a wheelbarrow containing a formless mass, ostensibly a corpse, but the feet show signs of life. It is not until we tour the city that we learn the extent of the destruction. We come across corpses every 100 to 200 yards. The bodies of civilians that I examined had bullet holes in their backs. These people had presumably been fleeing and were shot from behind. Of the perhaps 1,000 disarmed soldiers that we had quartered at the Ministry of Justice, between 400 and 500 were driven from it with their hands tied. We assumed they were shot since we later heard several salvos of machine gun fire. These events have left us frozen with horror. Mr. Hahn says that 3 young girls of about 14 or 15 have been dragged from a house in our neighborhood. December 16th. All the shelling and bombing we have thus far experienced are nothing in comparison to the terror that we are going through now. There is not a single shop outside our zone that has not been looted, and now pillaging, rape, murder, and mayhem are occurring inside the zone as well. There is not a vacant house, whether with or without a foreign flag, that has not been broken into and looted. No Chinese even dares set foot outside his house. When the gates to my garden are open to let my car leave the ground, women and children on the street outside kneel and bang their heads against the ground, pleading to be allowed to camp on my garden grounds. You simply cannot conceive of the misery. As I write this, the fists of Japanese soldiers are hammering at the back gates of the garden. Since my boys don't open up, heads appear along the top of the wall. When I suddenly show up with my flashlight, they beat a hasty retreat. We open the main gate and walk after them a little distance until they vanish into the dark, narrow streets, where assorted bodies have been lying in the gutter for 3 days now. It makes you shudder in revulsion. All the women and children, their eyes big with terror, sitting on the grass in the garden, pressed closely together, in part to keep warm, in part to give each other courage. Their one hope is that I, the foreign devil, will drive these evil spirits away.
The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of rape and brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted cases are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in and without warning or reason killed 5 or 6 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. I wonder when it will stop and we will be able to catch up with ourselves again. 2 nights ago, December 16th, I was here in the same spot writing a page of this epistle, and when to put it with the rest, I couldn't find it. I hope the Japanese haven't located. Today marks the 6th day, December 18th, 1937, of the modern Dante's Inferno, written in huge letters with blood and rape. Murder by the wholesale and rape by the thousands of cases. There seems to be no stop to the ferocity, lust, and sadism of the brutes. At first I tried to be pleasant to them to avoid arousing their ire, but the smile has gradually worn off, and my stare is fully as cool and as fishy as theirs.
Although Chang first places the reason for why Nanking happened on the bloody siege of Shanghai, which seemed to have turned the marching Japanese ugly, near the end of her book, she shows depth as she discloses the historiography of Nanking, meaning she looked to understand why some events are continuously remembered and studied by historians, and why some historical events like Nanking are tossed into oblivion. Chang first turns to Tanaka for an explanation and agrees that the hierarchical system imposed on the Japanese impacted the military endeavors in China, as a lowly sergeant was now carrying the divine will of the emperor and thus stood superior to the Chinese subject. Secondly, Chang states that the Japanese educational system also affected soldiers, as it taught them to dehumanize the Chinese, to see them as subhuman and as pigs deserving of death. This attitude of supremacy isn't a fabricated lie, as there are records and statements of Japanese soldiers referring to Chinese people as pigs before they were executed. Finally, Chang looks at religion, which gave the emperor divinity, but it also gave the Japanese state total supremacy over Asia, and that it was Japan's destiny to control Asia. And so the executions, the mass killings, and the rape were considered just a necessity to the Holy War. However, Chang doesn't simply close her book with the why and by telling the reader that the story of Nanking is a cautionary tale. Rather, Chang boldly states that there has been a second rape of Nanking, as the Japanese may have long buried the Chinese that they massacred under blood-soaked soil. But for the past 90 years, the Japanese state has been trying to toss the very memory of Nanking into historical oblivion. Japan is trying its very best to make sure future generations forget, and so that they never have to bear responsibility for the war crimes that were committed. And yet, even after 90 years, people have carried the torch of truth that the victims held, and they have passed it on to so many different people, as it's been passed off to Tanaka, to Chang, to Dower, and finally, it has somehow been passed on to me. And the truth, it burns, and it's still burning in the year 2023 in the face of Japanese denial. I now carry that torch of truth, and I'm hoping it will forever burn. As by the end of this video, I'm hoping to pass it on to you. You will be responsible for spreading the truth and for carrying the memory of Nanking.
Every time you tell me something, I figure that you're lying.
Once upon a time, before Twitter died, I tweeted snippets of my research and my initial thoughts about a book I was reading. The book in question was Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking, and suddenly I began to receive replies from a Japanese person. They first replied about 20 times, and at first I thought they were a bot, but the replies kept coming. 20 turned into 40, and 11 hours later, they had replied more than 100 times. All of it was denial and misinformation. They denied the deaths and the forced labor of prisoners of war. They denied the comfort women system and sexual enslavement. And they denied Nanking. Finally, even after I blocked them and warned people about them, they kept stalking me and insulting me, telling the world.
He still blocks and can't even argue back. That silence is proof of the correctness of my claim. A coward has no right to tell history.
As a historian, a person who was taught how citations work, what information is real, and how to find archival records, I could probably make a little fun video ripping this person's claims apart with ease. But at the heart of it, there is a bigger and a more serious issue at hand, and that is that this denial is taught and it's further passed down. This denial, although popular online, isn't new. Rather, this denial began after the war as high military officers took positions of power, and in the final parts of her book, Iris Chang highlights many politicians who emerged over the years who carried this denial.
In 1990, Ishihara Shintaro, a leading member of Japan's conservative Liberal Democratic Party, told reporters, "People say that the Japanese media made a Holocaust there in Nanjing, but that is not true. It is a story made up by the Chinese. It has tarnished the image of Japan, but it is a lie."
However, the politicians are not the only people who carry and spread this denial, but also mangakas, anime producers, singers, and actors. But it isn't just denial. Rather, it's a denial mixed with intimidation. For an example, back in the 90s, the mayor of Nagasaki attempted to apologize for the war crimes. He first faced mobs of hate, but it turned ugly as someone attempted to assassinate him and actually shot him. The denial of war crimes has its roots in something sick.
Now go! Let the legend come back to life.
Have you ever heard the idea referred to as the sins of the father? When I first encountered it, I was watching an MGS V trailer where Kojima, a Japanese video games developer, purposely chose a song about the sins of the father. And the following line always gets me, as Donna Brooke hammers the idea that the sins never die.
The sins never die. Can't wash the blood off our hands. Let the world feel us all.
Although this line is very much connected to the lore of MGS, as the father of the Twin Snakes is Big Boss, the legendary soldier who has a questionable legacy, I tend to connect it to war crimes and crimes committed by colonial and imperial states. In my research, I stumbled into a Reddit user who said that the sins of the father idea is silly, as to this person, the Japanese of today do not bear the sins of their fathers, or their grandfathers, who committed war crimes in the Second World War. But this mindset is one of a settler colonist, as if you ask a white Canadian if they carry the sins of their forefathers who came to this land, stole the land, starved its people, and kidnapped the children to forcefully assimilate them, they would answer with denial that the ancestors of white Canadian settlers no longer carry the sins of their fathers. But they do. To bear the sins of the father does not mean the individual is guilty, but rather that the individual must bear responsibility for what their fathers, grandfathers, and even great-grandfathers did. Even if the forefather was a humble farmer who was distant from other settlers, they still took part in the project of colonialism. Individuals thus were collectively involved in the project of colonization, and although some may claim that the state and the church are responsible for the residential schools, white settler towns were created to disbar indigenous peoples and keep them locked away in reserves. It was a collective colonial project where everyone was to do their task to maintain the state and the status quo. The Japanese case differs, as Tanaka cements that all fathers and grandfathers took part in the war, and most of the young of today can easily trace things back. However, when it comes to the crimes of the past, people are quick to place responsibility on the state and absolve the individuals who are actively involved in the project. Or the state absolves itself and pins the crimes on the individuals. In Japan's case, both bear responsibility, and Japan seemed to have escaped its responsibility by placing the entire responsibility on the emperor and used him to absolve the state and the people who committed crimes all over Asia. This was the benefit of using the family model, where the emperor was the head of the family, and so the chain of responsibility led up to him. And although there were trials for Japanese war crimes, those who collectively committed them never bore responsibility, and top-level politicians, military officers, and civilians got away. In comparison to Germany, this differs greatly, as after the war, Germany at the very least apologized, acknowledged that the Nazis not only committed crimes, but an ethnic genocide, and made sure to educate the future. The Japanese, on the other hand, first pinned the responsibility on the emperor, rode a justified wave of victimhood, never recognized the crimes its people and the state committed, and further began to deny the crimes. This tossing of responsibility has affected the future as it built a sick culture of denial and a complete whitewashing of history. Both the denial and the whitewashing of history has aided fringe far-right Japanese groups, but also politicians who cater to the right. The late and very dead Shinzo Abe serves as an example for this, as Abe attempted to revive Japanese militarism and make Japan great again by distorting the past and denying war crimes. According to Abe, they were fabrications. And by using this logic, he would deny the existence of the comfort women system and Nanking. All of this was said in the name of rewriting Japanese history to make it seem like Japan in the Second World War had a glorious and harmonious imperial past. This video proves it didn't. All of this leads up to the brewing Japanese fascism in Japan, as many ordinary people carry the same view as Abe, that Japan must remilitarize, and it isn't so it can defend itself against the North Korean or Chinese boogeyman, but so it could reassert its dominance over Asia, to put other Asians back in their so-called proper place. However, that's for like another video. This video, for most of its run, sought to answer the question, why did the Japanese commit war crimes in Asia, and what drove them psychologically? However, this video had a secret agenda, as I wanted you to think about who is responsible for such crimes. Is it the emperor? Is it the politicians? The military commanders? The soldiers on the ground? The Japanese people who are living and benefiting from empire? This may be a hot take, but all bear responsibility, even the people living in Japan today, because they have yet to escape the sins of their fathers. For the sins haven't died.
The sins never die. Can't wash the blood off her hands.
Rather, the war crimes that Japan committed will continue to haunt the nation and its people. It will continue to haunt them even if politicians apologized, even if war criminals were trialed and executed for their crimes. And even if Japan tries to bury the history of its crimes, attempts to toss it into oblivion, and tries to mask it with a fabricated, fake, glorious past. Because the specter never dies, and the truth will continue to survive. But for the foreseeable future, Japan and the Japanese people are going to have to carry that weight until they acknowledge their sins and shift their country towards a more positive, healthier view of the past. This view will guide the future And just maybe it will convince them to be better than their forefathers and never turn into demons. Finally, as a person who is now a torchbearer of these heavy, painful, and dreadful truths, I pass them on to you, dear viewer. You are now responsible to share this truth and carry this fire in the face of the sick denial. Or you may choose to do the opposite and deny everything I've said. But keep in mind, whether you accept or deny the truth, you're going to carry that weight forever. From 1910 up to its collapse in 1945, the Empire of Japan and its people committed war crimes all across Asia. From forced labor, where both Asians and prisoners of war were forced to build the Empire of Japan and its colonies, to the enslavement of women who were kidnapped and trafficked all across Asia so they may pleasure the so-called brave warriors, to the biological experiments of Unit 731 and how America aided in covering it all up and recruiting war criminals into its own biological and chemical weapons program. And finally, to the rape of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands were mass murdered and tens of thousands of women were raped. But I'm being generous because the crimes go on and on, from Manila to the enslavement of the Vietnamese, to the death marches, the Bataan marches, and even cannibalism. To cover all the crimes would require a 10-hour video, so I decided to focus on only 3. Although looking back at the past and learning about war crimes is a depressing task as you come face to face with unquestionable realities, the people who Japan occupied were not passive victims, as in each and every colony, the people rose up and fought their oppressors. From China, where Mao and his communist soldiers tag team with their bitter enemies, the nationalist government, to Korea, where communism also flourished and a fight for liberation began. But unlike Vietnam, America intervened instantaneously and bombed it to rubble, forcing the nation to be split in half. And finally, to Vietnam, where the communists rose under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The Vietnamese would not only fight for their liberation under the Japanese, but would then come face to face with their ex-colonizers, the French. The Vietnamese would utterly embarrass France as they were defeated and kicked out, bringing Vietnam a brief sigh of liberation until the Americans stormed in.
We heard no more from Dien Bien Phu. It was the end of the garrison. It was the end of the French adventure in Indochina. It was indeed the end of the French Empire.
French troops leave Hanoi forever, but many of them are headed for another long, bloody war in Algeria.
But whoever the occupier was, the Vietnamese fought and won. Although many historians focus on Vietnam, liberation was sought all across Asia and the world. However, even with this rich history of liberation, I don't think it's wise for historians to brush the painful screams of the victims of war. I don't think it's wise for historians to whitewash history and aid those who deny these crimes. I don't think it's wise for historians to plainly call Japan militaristic or imperial. I think historians who refer to Japan by these labels are cowards who deny or ignore the existence of the fascism that took hold of Japan. It's a fascism that rose, it grew, and then it roared during the time of war. I don't think it's wise for historians to simply cover what these crimes are, to go over them like they're simple crimes on a list. I think historians have to wisen up, to explore the why and the possibility that these crimes can be committed again and again by any nation in this world. Finally, I don't think it's wise for historians to deny the culture of denial in Japan, as something must be done. This is not to say I'm a wise man with all the answers. or that I'm wiser than historians who have their PhDs. I am simply a historian who eyes the future and is a student of Franz Ibrahim Fanon. I'm a historian who doesn't just combat Japanese war crimes denialism, but those who deny the harms of settler colonialism and imperialism that ravaged the globe. This story of Japanese war crimes is a sliver of the entire story of war crimes and crimes that have been committed on humanity.
Colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence. National liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization is a historical process. It cannot be understood, it cannot become clear to itself, except by the movements which give it historical form and content. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding.
Hi, welcome to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this kind of history content, make sure you subscribe because I do have other history essays I've been itching to make. Or consider donating to my Patreon because it takes a lot of work making these videos and I think I may need a new mic. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Also, I want to throw a huge, big thank you to That Dang Dad, Bridget Empire, Mainly Mandy, and NACAV Videos for lending me their voice. If you aren't already subscribed to them, do it right now. NACAV doesn't even have 1,000 subs, and they make some incredible videos on Asian media. The next video in this series on war crimes is called The History of War Crimes from Nuremberg to Iraq, but we'll see if that's like a doable scope. One thing I want to correct is something I mentioned in Crime 3 on Nanking. I make it seem like the commander-in-chief of the Shanghai and Nanking region is this benevolent, kind person, and I wanted to correct myself there, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow. Iwane was not benevolent, as he saw conquest as a necessity for growing the empire, and thus by an extension, so were the murders, the rapes, and the oppression of the Chinese and those who Japan colonized. Rather, what Iwane was so worried about was optics. He was fine with armies raiding on the way to Nanking, but once it came to taking the historic city, he began to worry about how the world would perceive them. So the discipline he tried to instate was to show the world that the Japanese were these kind and gentle conquerors. And the same logic is used by those who deny these crimes. They point at the official entry or pictures of the Chinese smiling and say, see, we were nice conquerors. The people who we conquered loved us. It's a bunch of bullshit. Last thing, I know this video was a bit of a downer, but the next video will be fun. I promise. It's the part 2 of my Attack on Titan video, and this time I know how to edit, I know how to do sound effects, I know how to make things fun, and it's going to be a lot better. So yeah, it's going to be so much fun. I've been itching to write it for months now, and I'm going to start once this video goes up. So hopefully I'll see you there. If not, then I'll be sad. You know how I am. Thanks for watching this extremely long video. I don't know if people stick around to the end, but if you do, I love you. And if you don't, then I don't hate you, but yeah, you're never going to know this. So this is a secret between me and the person who's made it this far. If you made it this far, wow, great, awesome. I don't know what to give you, but I wish I could give you something. So yeah, here's this. Here's my love. That's what I give you. You got my love. You're loved by me. Anyways, I hope you learned something, and I hope this video was good. I hope the audio didn't peak. I hope the sound effects were nice and cool. What else? I hope the audio, like the music, wasn't too loud. If it was, let me know. Yeah, I was like, I took like an entire week polishing this thing, making sure everything was good. And yeah, it should be good. I have faith in myself, but if it's not, then damn, tell me how bad it is. And I'll try and fix it the next time. Okay, I think that's everything. Bye bye.